Hey there, folks, and welcome to this week's episode of Jungle Drums. I'm sorry, I know there hasn't been an episode for the last 2 weeks. Look, it was the end of the academic year for me, so I had all sorts of stuff I had to get together, including sitting another exam, quite a few projects. And oh man, what a 2 weeks to miss, right? Because we had Computex, we had E3. So let's try to just, do a little wrap up of some of the things. And obviously for E3, there was all sorts of great stuff. And of course, in scholarlygamers.com, there were several great articles about all of the stuff that was popping up at E3. But first, I want to talk about Computex. Now, Computex, of course, is the big, huge tech company exhibit over in Taiwan. It's basically every kind of tech tubers and, nerds' dream to go to Computex, because that's when you get to see the latest and greatest hardware, whether it's processors, cases, water cooling systems. All of these companies end up showing all of their goods at Computex. So sure enough, over at WCCFtech.com, there's a little roundup, basically their best of Computex 2018. So I thought that would serve as a pretty good roundup for us, because there's all sorts of stuff that happened there, but really there's only a couple of things that really stood out for me. One of the big ones, of course, was Intel. Now this was actually a bit controversial, because the way that they had framed it initially was they had unveiled their next big thing, which was, if I pull up this picture here, was their monolithic 28-core processor. Now, the big deal about this was they had it running at 5 gigs, and so this somehow... Well, some people felt they were misled into believing that this was going to be shipping at 5 gig. A 28-core processor with a 5 gig clock, I mean, that's huge, right? That's crazy talk. But as it turns out, there was a little bit of behind-the-scenes issues or problems where the person at the stand actually didn't have all of the information. As it turns out, it wasn't like the actual processor we're going to be getting in the near future. It was actually one of the Xeon parts, not the desktop version. It was a server CPU. But Intel did come out and say afterwards, oh no, look, this has been misconstrued. We didn't mean to mislead anyone. It was running at 5 gig, but with some crazy non-conventional cooling, I might add. But anyway, regardless, Intel has announced that they're stepping up the desktop CPU line in the near future with a 14 nanometer 28-core CPU. So it's going to be quite interesting. And of course what makes it quite unique is that these 28 cores are going to be on a monolithic die, which I could spend for the next 30 minutes talking just about that, because that's huge. It's a very, it's a phenomenal achievement. But anyway, it was big news. But the really big news that I think got everyone's attention was AMD basically just crapping all over that Intel 28 core, because they announced the second generation of Threadripper, which is now sampling. And now Threadripper, when it first launched, an amazing processor. Okay, not really built for gamers. Don't get me wrong, of course you can game just fine on it. But, it's really more set up for content creators. It can tear through video processing and rendering. And same with our synthetic benchmarks. If you've got a top-of-the-line video card paired up with one of these, it'll really just... tear through those benchmarks. But of course, the original Threadripper, the top-of-the-line version, was an 18-core 36-thread processor, which is pretty darn amazing. Threadripper 2 is going to have, their flagship top-of-the-line model, pricing still to be determined, is going to have 32 cores, 64 threads. That is going to be insane, right? Okay, yes, Intel and QuickSync, now that Adobe Premiere has QuickSync support, can render videos quite quickly. It's really been quite interesting as of late with the new 8th gen i7s, which are the 6-core 12 threads. if you enable QuickSync and render in Premiere, it will outperform a Ryzen 8-core 16-thread processor. But of course, in other video editing programs that don't take advantage of QuickSync, Vegas, I'm looking at you, it's the Ryzen still have an upper hand. But with this second-gen Threadripper, it's going to be just, and crazy. It's crazy to think that this is going to be a mainstream processor running 64 threads. I mean, you go back a few years and you wouldn't even have dreamt of something that crazy. So it'll be interesting to see what their pricing model is going to be. Does twice as many cores mean twice the price? Keep in mind that the Threadripper, when it launched, was considerably cheaper than the i9 processors. We'll just have to wait and see. My gut is telling me, since the current gen Threadrippers have came down dramatically in price, that the Threadripper 2s probably won't be that much higher than the original Threadripper was at launch, but we'll see. We shall see. Another quite interesting bit of tech that was unveiled at Computex was, of course, from Asus, and this was the ROG Republic of Gamers phone. I guess they wanted to get on that bandwagon after Razer came out with theirs. Yes, I've got a few buddies that have the Razer phone, and yeah, it's a cool bit of tech. The audio is awesome. Playing games on it is great, but as a phone, it's okay. But the ROG phone looks quite interesting. It looks like it's going to support all sorts of different peripherals. Looks like the gaming experience is definitely going to be quite cool, and aesthetically, it does look very, very nice. Whether or not it's going to be a good quality phone, that remains to be seen, but it does look like it's got the tech to be a pretty darn good gaming platform for all of you mobile gamers out there. Let's see, what are some other things that popped out at Computex? Oh yes, the EVGA Supernova, the 2000G Plus. Take a look at this bad boy. A 2000 watt, or 2 kilowatt is another way of describing it, power supply. And I don't think that's really aimed at gamers, let's be honest. Even if you've got a killer i9 or a Threadripper processor running, a double, possibly even a triple or quadruple GPU setup and water cooling, I don't think most of us need 2000 watts. It seems that this is clearly targeting the miners, those good old cryptocurrency miners out there. But then again, one could argue that if you're attempting to overclock an i9 7980XE, that having that extra room is probably quite a good thing. Because when it comes into power supplies, remember, you try to hit a sweet spot. You don't want to be too near the max, hence why most power supplies are rated at that 80%, of their target rate. But the sweet spot tends to be, what was it again? Somewhere between 50 to 70%. So, 50 to 70% of 2000 watts. Yeah, if you've got a lot of beefy hardware in there and you're overclocking it, you could very well possibly be in that that ballpark. So you could, but no, quite interesting. And there's quite a few things that happen at Computex, but I just want to pull this one up really quickly. And this was, of course, the BandQ 4K HDR projector, which you don't hear that much about projectors these days. I remember years ago I had a good buddy that absolutely loved, instead of buying a big screen TV, he had a pretty badass Sony full HD projector. And so it turned out, I think, what did it equate to? I think about 120 inches on the screen, on his projector screen. And it was pretty cool. It had a really neat setup. There was, instead of having a big crazy TV, you just had this panel, that would kind of come up and down. And of course, you had the projector ceiling mounted. But so, to have a projector that's a 4K HDR version, that's pretty darn cool. And it looks like, the BandQ version is going to be relatively cheap, somewhere around $1,500 US, which I know, it doesn't sound cheap, but again, for for this kind of level of quality, 4K HDR and a projector, that is pretty darn good. But, you know, aside from that, look, there was so much cool stuff at Computex, including, I'll have to show a peek of this really quickly, of course, was Lian Li's RGB power cables. About the only part of a PC so far that hasn't been hit by the RGB trend has been the cables, but sure enough, Lian Li have announced those, and they also had the 8-pin ones, you know, ones that connect to your graphics card on display as well. So there you go. If you like the RGB aesthetic, soon you will be able to have every single component, including the cables, in your PC be RGB. Right, so E3. Now, I admittedly didn't get to watch very much of E3 firsthand. I did watch the Microsoft conference as it was live, and of course at Scholarly Gamers, our head of IT, Marcus, had ran some really cool live blogs. You know, so what that meant on the website was, as he was watching these conferences, he actually had a live blog set up on the website where he was posting his thoughts, live reactions. We had several of the streamers for Scholarly Gamers do some live streams as well with their E3 reactions, and you know, so check those out. They're pretty darn cool. But no, I didn't get to watch very many of the press conferences. I did watch the Microsoft one, and I thought that was quite interesting. You know, looks, I can see where they're going with some things. They were really going on about the Game Pass, and I thought something that was quite interesting was how they brought up, you know, about the next generation of console, but how they're also looking at game streaming. Now, I've got on quite good authority from quite several different industry folk, you know, software and hardware, that are convinced that we don't have very many more generations of consoles left. If you look at the PC gaming space, just over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of companies coming out with these streaming services. We've covered them here on Jungle Drums. One that really comes to mind, oh, what was the name of them again? Let me try to think. Was, I've got it in my, yeah, Shadow, that was one of them. And where Shadow, you know, you pay a subscription fee. All you need is something that has the ability to connect to the internet. You know, it can be a really low-spec PC, a laptop of some kind, or you can even purchase or will rent from them kind of a control box. You know, think almost like a Steam box, which, you know, is very low-spec. It's just like a Linux box of some kind. But what it happens is it connects remotely to a top-of-the-line gaming PC. So there's been a lot of companies that have been popping up like that. And, you know, there's no doubt it's much nicer and better, in my opinion, to have your own PC that you can customize and build yourself. But, you know, I'm slightly biased there. This whole kind of concept of streaming, you know, or remotely accessing hardware, it makes sense, because think about it, you never have to pay for upgrades. You pay a subscription fee, and then as new hardware comes out, that company does the upgrades on their end. Nowadays with fiber and a lot of areas, yes, I know my buddies over in the States and Canada, depending on where you live, you don't have that great internet, but here in the UK, we're fairly lucky. You know, the latency is a non-issue. So at least in the PC world, it looks like these types of services are becoming more popular. And even game studios are looking at, instead of releasing games in the conventional manner, where you buy them, keep in mind when you buy a game, you're only paying for the license to use it. You don't actually technically own that game, which I think a lot of people don't quite understand. You need to read the actual fine print of your end user license agreement, the EULA. But yeah, you never actually technically own a game. You're paying for the right to use it, to access it. That's how software works. And so a lot of these game studios are looking into this, where, you know, you would end up just not really owning the game, but instead it would be streaming. And so it makes sense for consoles to be looking at this. Can you imagine if we moved to a system where basically Microsoft and Sony are concentrating on games rather than their hardware? So all you would have is some type of device at home, and you could play whatever the hell games you want depending who you subscribe to. It would take console wars completely out of the equation, and it would also take out the need to then purchase the next iteration of console as they upgrade. So it's quite interesting. A lot of people, like I said, folk that I've talked to kind of on the DL are saying, yeah, that they can see that in the near future, and many of them are convinced that both Sony and Microsoft, that we've probably only got one, maybe two more generations of console before we move to this type of model. So I thought that was something to really take away from E3, something that wasn't really focused on, but was some kind of mentioned. But come on, let's talk about some of the games that popped up. Of course, one of the big ones that everyone was looking forward to was to hear more about Anthem. And of course, Anthem is the third-person action game coming from Electronic Arts, developed by BioWare. And, you know, we still didn't get that much of a deeper look into it. Yes, there is quite a bit more gameplay footage now, which looked, you know, relatively tidy. It did look decent. But still, there's just so much that isn't known about it. You know, it looks like a combination of Monster Hunter and Titanfall, but then little aspects of Destiny as well as Tom Clancy's The Division. But it does look interesting. Of course, one of the big controversies that's popped up since it was, you know, further unveiled is the lack of PvP, at least on launch. And so, you know, there's quite a few skeptics out there, and it's quite easy to not get hyped up nowadays, you know, after so many games have disappointed us. But, you know, in my opinion, BioWare has always been known for great stories, so I've got a little bit of faith in Anthem. I wouldn't necessarily say I'll be rushing out the door to grab it as soon as it comes out, but I'll definitely be keeping an eye on it. One of the games that definitely caught my attention was, of course, The Division 2. We got to see some actual in-game footage, and it looked absolutely amazing. Now, if you've got, you know, a decent enough memory, you'll remember that when the original Division was unveiled at E3, we were shown something that was absolutely amazing, but then the actual final product that was delivered paled in comparison to the E3 reveal. I'm pretty sure the studio at Massive has learnt that lesson, so I don't think there's going to be any smoke and mirrors this time. I'm fairly confident that what we see is what we're going to get, and what we saw did look absolutely fantastic. Of course, the background now is Washington, D.C., so it's not really a continuation. I mean, it is like in the world. You know, I think it was, I forget the timeline. I don't know if it was 6 months or a year after the events of the original Division, but so, you know, it's different agents, a different team, but still, you know, going along the same type of storyline. I'm assuming it's a case of the dollar flu is now actually infected there as well. It's gotten out of New York City, or is it something different? I don't know, can't remember. But yeah, so that caught my attention. Of course, Forza Horizon 4, I love my racing games, so yeah, that looks fantastic. It's set in good old Blighty, set over here in the UK. Looks like that's going to be quite a stunning game. That releases 2nd of October, obviously for PC and Xbox, so, you know, keep an eye out for that one. Another huge reveal was Cyberpunk 2077. That game looks absolutely fantastic. You know, looks like it's quite colorful, a fun kind of 1980s inspired take on Cyberpunk. At least on the surface it looks that way, but as we know, it's going to be, you know, gritty. There's lots of violence, swearing, drug use, and even nudity, which some people are actually kind of up in arms about and starting to question the developer, CD Projekt Red. You know, is this too much? But of course, if you don't know CD Projekt Red, if you're not familiar with the Witcher games, then, you know, that you obviously really don't know what they're about, do you? But it does look like a pretty fantastic game. Of course, we also saw more news about Death Stranding, what looks like actual in-game footage, which some people are kind of jokingly saying, "Oh, look, it's hiking simulator," or you're just a delivery guy traveling around. We didn't get too much more of the story. We did get to see the introduction of two more characters, two female characters. So all that looked quite interesting, but we're still not any closer to anyone really knowing what the hell Death Stranding is about. But hey, hopefully we'll get more info about that. One of the big surprises E3, of course, was the Resident Evil 2 remake, which looks fantastic for all you Resident Evil fans. That'll be coming, of course, to PC, PS4, and Xbox, not until January next year. Skull and Bones, which is supposed to be coming out autumn of this year. Of course, that is the naval combat from Assassin's Creed 4, but now it's its own game, and it does look cool. It'll be interesting to see how it fares, because Sea of Thieves obviously has been out for quite a while now. They're doing a lot with Sea of Thieves, they're improving it, adding more things into it, and so it'll be quite interesting to see how Skull and Bones fares. It's going to have to bring something very different to the table in order to kind of nudge Sea of Thieves out of the way, but considering how good the naval combat was in Assassin's Creed 4, and of course, Assassin's Creed Black Flag, I think it'll be fine. I think Skull and Bones should be quite cool. And then, of course, speaking of Assassin's Creed, another big unveil from Ubisoft was Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is set in ancient Greece, which most of us did actually think that's where it was going to be, but it looks, again, fantastic. It looks, graphically, if you didn't think they could improve on Origins, well, I think, they probably have quite a little bit there, but it looks quite good as far as, it looks like, there's going to be a lot of kind of big battles going on, and for the first time in a Assassin's Creed game, you actually have a choice to play as a male or female main character, which I know you could argue, well, wait a minute though, in Syndicate you could switch between the two, and yes, that's true, but this actually, for your entire playthrough, you get to select, which gender you identify with better for the purposes of playing through the game. Another game that kind of got everyone's attention was Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. In fact, it was a great article up on scholarlygamers.com, talking about how it's not just another Dark Souls, but that looks quite, pretty badass as well. So does Ghost of Tsushima, as a game set in medieval Japan. What else really popped out from? I'm trying to think. Of course, Battlefield 5, if you're into that stuff, they showed more theirs. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, huge deal there. Supposed to be featuring every single character from, all of the previous Super Smash Brother games. Rage 2, got to see some more of that, which I think the original Rage was quite underrated. I enjoyed that, actually. I know it wasn't perfect, but it was decent. Oh, and a sequel to Ori, Ori and the Will o' the Wisps, which looks pretty amazing as well. The graphics in those games are fabulous. Oh, Last of Us 2, of course, for PlayStation 4. And it is one of the most discussed trailers at 3.3, in fact. For the first time we got to see some actual in-game footage of it, the trailer, if you go search for it and you'll see it, it was really quite brutal, where they slaughter a whole bunch of survivors, but that wasn't really the controversial part. The controversial part of this trailer was because there was a very nice kiss between Ellie and Dina, which, of course, in this day and age, people just start freaking out about for no good reason. But, oh well. I don't see what's wrong with people. But anyway, that looks pretty cool. And, of course, Dying Light 2 as well. That's been overhauled for PC, PS4, and Xbox One. And, that's really all for me when it comes to E3. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on. Of course, there was Destiny reveals, that were kind of happening, but I don't know, Destiny 2. We're just gonna have to see how things pan out with that. Now, an interesting development moving on from E3 is something that wasn't mentioned at E3. Actually, has been mentioned quite a long time. I pulled this article from Trusted Reviews, and this is about virtual reality on the Xbox One. Microsoft's console virtual reality plans come to a strange end. Now, it's basically been 2 years that Microsoft has been dodging questions about VR as well as AR, augmented reality. Because if you go back in time, if you remember, back in June of 2016, so 2 years ago, Microsoft announced the Xbox One X as Project Scorpio. And the headline was that it was going to be a futuristic console that would be capable of running games in native 4K and delivering high-fidelity VR. And that's a direct quote from Phil Spencer, right? So that was in June of 2016. Fast forward to March 2017, and Microsoft announced a new family of mixed reality headsets for Windows 10, and says they'll be coming to Project Scorpio in 2018, right? So right off the bat, when we learned about Project Scorpio, we're being basically, kind of built up, hyped up that, oh, hey, Microsoft's going to come out with VR. We all know that the VR and the PlayStation 4 has been quite successful, reasonably well. It's for a VR headset, it's priced quite competitively. I mean, it's way cheaper, than other offerings. And for the most part, the experience is quite good. So the whole thought of Microsoft doing one as well, and now having a console that was going to have the power to really, give us some really badass VR, everyone just sucked it right up. By June of 2017, so E3 last year, Xbox One X was, officially announced. It was no longer just Project Scorpio. But if you remember the conference last year, there was absolutely no mention of VR or even AR or, mixed reality. Instead, they focused solely on the resolution. And then, again, when the Xbox One X finally launched there in November of last year, there was no mention of VR. When asked directly about it, Xbox execs had said the focus is still on PC VR. We just don't believe right now that the state of the art of what VR can do in a living room, from the headsets to the wires to the state of wireless, that as such it's an enjoyable experience. But Kipman, who's the HoloLens creator, had said, over time, absolutely, we'll have it on Xbox, but we have nothing new to announce today. And, it's been radio silence ever since, until now. This month, Microsoft has finally confirmed that it does not have any plans specific to Xbox console in virtual reality or mixed reality. So, it's not completely unexpected. In many ways, VR hasn't quite delivered. It is quite a pricey endeavor. But then again, once you've experienced it, it is amazing. I mean, if we talk about like racing games, any type of simulator, and even first-person games, it's truly amazing. But it does require, of course, expensive hardware, and of course, expensive PC components to really give you the best performance you want. Because it's one thing, trying to get a nice steady frame rate on a normal screen, but trying to get a steady frame rate, for your VR headset that isn't going to make you throw up, it takes quite a bit of power. So, Microsoft, they're not exactly saying that they're never going to bring VR to consoles, but it doesn't look like it's going to be happening anytime soon. So there. Now, another bit of news that kind of caught a lot of people's attention, and I think I've seen some people get really kind of shocked by it, and there's been a little bit of sensationalism in some media outlets without really going into it, too much depth of it. But anyway, you've probably heard on social media, or possibly even in your news app, on your phone, about a recent decision by the World Health Organization. So let's just start with the headline, right? So I'm sourcing this from Polygon, and this is gaming disorder is classified as a mental health condition. Right, so if you missed it, the World Health Organization basically, they've unveiled the plans. They're adding gaming disorder to their International Classification of Diseases, which is known as the ICD. So the next iteration of the ICD is ICD 11. And so sure enough, they're putting in a classification which, I'll read it verbatim for you. Gaming disorder is characterized by a pattern of persistent or recurrent gaming behavior, digital gaming or video gaming, which may be online, over the internet, or offline, manifested by 1. Impaired control over gaming, whether that be onset, frequency, intensity, duration, termination, and context. 2. Increasing priority given to gaming to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other life interests and daily activities. 3. Continuation or escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences. The behavior pattern is of sufficient severity to result in significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. The pattern of gaming may be continuous or episodic and recurrent. The gaming behavior and other features are normally evident of a period of at least 12 months in order for a diagnosis to be assigned, although the required duration may be shortened if all diagnostic requirements are met and symptoms are severe. Right, so what does this all mean? Well, okay. When the World Health Organization, or, the WHO, not the cool WHO, but, the WHO, they do this with the ICD. The ICD is basically this compendium of all sorts of different disorders, diseases, and injuries. Like, for example, there's an actual listing in the ICD for bitten by cow, right? That's actually listed in the ICD. And the reason the ICD is important is because this is what is used when it comes to, like, for instance, here in the UK, the National Health Service. In order to have something paid for, the ICD is used as a reference. It basically allows, any type of injury or treatment required for something to be, to be actually given out, and actually, so the individual doesn't have to pay for it. In countries that have, a state, like a National Health Service like we do. Now, over in the States, right, the ICD isn't binding because they use the DSM, which is a different manual altogether. This is where it gets interesting. When we get into talking about disorders, whether that's personality disorders or likewise diseases or illnesses, whilst the ICD is recognized internationally, you have to keep in mind that each country somewhat plays by their own rules. The American Psychiatric Association, the APA, they deem, what they consider, all their members vote and whatnot, whether, something's classified a certain way. A few years back, one of the biggest deals that happened in the States was when they actually removed the diagnosis of Asperger's. And instead, now it's tied in with what's now known as ASD, Autistic Spectrum Disorder, which was quite controversial at the time, because people were saying, well, wait a minute, what about people who identify, that this is their identity, that they have Asperger's, now you're taking that away from them. And likewise, up in Canada, the CPA, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, they'll kind of take things from the ICD, maybe take some things from the CPA. Over here in the UK, the BPS, the British Psychological Society, mainly uses ICD, but I know for a fact that practitioners also use the DSM. But when it comes to like our national healthcare, ICD is what's referenced. But anyway, right, this doesn't mean like as of right now, if you play a lot of video games, you have a gaming disorder. It doesn't mean that by any means. This is all being put into a draft for the next iteration, ICD 11, which is going to be presented in draft form May of next year, and it wouldn't actually go into effect until January 1st, 2022. right? So there's quite a few years now. This isn't a set in stone thing. They're just, mocking up the draft. To put this in the perspective for you, the last iteration of, the current iteration of ICD, which is ICD 10, was went live in 1992. And, sometimes ICD can be a little bit misguided or sometimes even behind the times. For example, it wasn't till ICD 10, the one that came in 1992, that homosexuality was no longer listed as a disease or a disorder, right? I mean, even, it wasn't until 92 that the World Health Organization said, okay, right, it's okay to, have a different sexuality. You're no longer, you don't have a disease. So this whole gaming disorder thing, it's quite interesting. It's going to be a case of really seeing how countries react to this, what the APA over in the States says, if they're going to update their DSM. Likewise over here in the UK, what the professionals actually think. Because from what I'm reading through a lot of professional websites, is that the research that the World Health Organization conducted is really being questioned. They're saying it's quite how's the word to put it? It's not really as focused as it should be. It's quite debatable. But this is what happens with social sciences. Whereas when you think of conventional science, when it comes to like physics and math, if you come up with a hypothesis, or a theorem, it gets proved, and it gets proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. Whereas with social sciences, it doesn't always necessarily work that way. You don't have to absolutely prove something 100%. You just have to have a strong enough argument that nobody can refute. It's more a case of, if you can't prove otherwise, then this should stand. And we've seen it, along the years with many different theories that have been, established. All these different models, the iceberg model, the whole concept of, whether if you experience behavior as a child, whether that continues into adult form. There's nothing definitive in all of these studies. It just tends to be, okay, what's widely accepted. And this is what's quite interesting when it comes to gaming disorder. It's not widely accepted. So I would expect to see quite a bit of debate and contention over the next couple of years, and I wouldn't be surprised if this actually doesn't make it into the final cut. Now, it's also worth mentioning that this isn't as crazy as you think it is. This isn't a case of, so if you play a lot of video games, like I've seen some media outlets sensationalize this and say, if you play more than 20 hours of video games a week, you have gaming disorder. Whereas when you look at how it's worded in the ICD, we're talking about gaming to such a point that you're actually, all of your other kind of life interests go out the window. You're no longer eating, you're no longer talking to family whatsoever. We're not talking about going on like a marathon, locking yourself up, like having a weekend, a weekend of just gaming and then Monday returning to your normal life. No, we're talking about that is your life, is just gaming, where you've lost interest in everything else. It's suspected that in all reality, when it comes to the world's population, this disorder is probably only about 1%. 1% of gamers, right? So it's really not this huge deal that a lot of people are trying to make it to be. And likewise, just because something is listed in the ICD, actually getting a diagnosis isn't that easy. I mean, I know for a fact over here in the United Kingdom, I've seen people that, it's quite, or at least it appears to be obvious, they have some sort of disorder. Like, for example, someone who exhibits all the traits of schizophrenia, or someone who, exhibits all the traits of a borderline personality disorder. But actually getting a diagnosis, especially over here, is quite a difficult situation because, it can... Of course, when we're talking about a country that has a national health service, we're talking about an entitlement to basically a lot of money throughout the course of that person's life. Whereas in the States, and I'm not trying to throw shade over America by any means, but because of the way that healthcare is privatized and HMOs, and it's a big business, it really does appear that diagnoses are really handed out a lot easier in America, because you're going to get that money no matter what. Oh yeah, this doctor said this, yes, and my HMO covers it or whatever. Whereas here in the UK, it's not that easy, and that's why something like this has to be in the ICD, because if it's not, then they can't actually give that diagnosis. But yeah, like I said, this is going to be quite interesting. The discussion about this is no doubt going to progress in the years to come, and we'll just have to kind of keep tabs on it and see what actually happens, because all it takes is for other professionals to publish contrasting theories, a difference of opinion, and if we're honest, cyber psychology is still in its infancy. I know that they've been screaming out for people who are pursuing their masters in psychology to try to specialize in this, but because there's so little actual material out there, it's a really, really difficult thing to study. But we'll just have to see. We'll have to see. But yes, don't get caught up in the sensationalism that some of the media outlets are really trying to, put around this. It seems like, if anything, there's been a bit of political pressure, given that video games have been in the headlines once again in kind of a negative way. And it just seems like this is kind of lip service of trying to throw something in there. But again, we'll see what happens. But anyway, that'll do it for this week's episode of Jungle Drums. Again, sorry for having the 2 weeks off, but we should be back to normally scheduled programming here on out, possibly. Might have to take a week here and there off, but we'll see. Either way, look, it's the summer. I've got other projects I need to do, and of course get ready for my next year at school, at university, onwards and upwards. But in the meantime, look, make sure to check out all of the Scholarly Gamers online. Remember, you can always search using the hashtag Scholarly Gamers, whether that's on Twitch, on YouTube. Just put it into Google, you'll find stuff. I promise you. Of course, check out the website, www.scholarlygamers.com, where you can find our streamer directory, see who's online right now. Speaking of online right now, the widget that's up here is actually, as you can see, the Discord one is broken. I don't know why it's doing that. I don't know if it's somewhere in the API or something, because there is not 0 people online. There's actually 59 people online right now, as you can see. But yes, make sure to check out the site. Just this week, the latest episode of Armchair Gaming, episode number 20 dropped, and it's a really, really good one. This one is now the Unbearable Gamer starting to talk about death, the concept of death and dying. So he's starting off with some of the Hindu, yoga's kind of beliefs on that, and he goes a little bit into Buddhism, and of course he's using Dark Souls 3 as the backdrop for it, which absolutely makes sense when you think of how Dark Souls, symbolizes death. Death's a huge part of that game series, so it just serves as the perfect backdrop for what the Unbearable Gamer has to say about that. But yeah, hey, always make sure to check out our video content. We should have the next episode of Proof of Console will be next week, and of course I've got my new series that I need to get working on, which should have been released last week, but it's been delayed. So anyway, in the meantime, have a great weekend. Make sure that you don't succumb to gaming disorder, and I'll catch you next time.